It's just after 10. Welcome to this, the ninth meeting of 2013. Welcome to members, press and the public, and just ask that everybody switches their mobile phones off, please. We've had no apologies this morning. Everyone is present. The first item on our agenda is a decision on taking business in private. So the question is whether we take item 5 in private. Are the committee agreed to that? Thank you. Now move to item 2 in our agenda, which is consideration of the Commonwealth Games 2014 progress report. This is number 2. Welcome the Auditor General for Scotland and Tricia Meldrum, the Portfolio Manager, Performance and Audit Group, and ask the Auditor General to introduce the report.
Thank you, Convener. The committee has already considered 2 reports on planning for the 2014 Commonwealth Games, first in 2009 and most recently in March 2012. Given the committee's request for a further update on planning for the Games this year, I'm pleased to bring the impact report on our 2012 audit to the committee today. This includes an update on progress against the recommendations and on the key risks we identified in that report. Audit Scotland generally produces impact reports around 12 months after publication of our main reports. These are largely for internal purposes, but we do publish them on our website. It's important for me to be clear that we haven't carried out an audit at this stage. Our comments on progress are based on reviews by the Commonwealth Games Federation, which members of the team observed, meetings with the strategic partners, the Scottish Government, Glasgow City Council and Glasgow 2014 Limited, evidence produced by the partners and their written updates to this committee. We found that the strategic partners have made progress against all the recommendations in our 2012 report. I'll briefly highlight some of the main areas. First of all, the partners have improved how they assess and review the Games budget, including the contingency budget, and these developments have contributed to improved budget management. The partners have reviewed and clarified the terms of reference for the governance and working groups, including their delegated authorities to make decision. They've integrated and streamlined some of the groups. The most recent Commonwealth Games Federation review stressed that the partners now need to review their arrangements again to make sure they're fit for purpose as the partners move into the very busy Games delivery phase over the next 12 months. There'll be a significant increase in the number of decisions that need to be made quickly and a significant increase in the number of staff and contractors involved, so everyone needs to be clear what their place is in that very complex picture. Thirdly, the partners jointly and individually have improved their risk management arrangements. And fourth, the Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council have done a lot to develop their planning for evaluating the Games legacy. There's now a lot more clarity about the outcomes and the indicators that they'll monitor, how this will be done, and over what timescale. The Scottish Government is supporting a more coordinated approach to legacy planning across local authorities, and every local authority involved now has a legacy lead at strategic and senior level. Finally, updating you on the key risk areas that we identified in 2012. There were 4 key risks we identified at that stage, and the partners are continuing to manage them. Having said that, they will obviously remain as risks until the Games are delivered. We identified risks of cost increases in the security budget, first of all. This was subsequently increased from £27.2 million to £90 million in December 2012, making the overall Games budget £563 million, representing an increase of 7% over the budget when we reported in 2012. Second, we identified risks in delivering the Athletes' Village on budget and risks of delays and cost increases in installing a temporary running track for the Games at Hampden Park. Both of these projects are currently on track to be delivered on time and on budget, with apologies for the unintended pun there, Convener. Finally, we identified risks that the organising committee needed to increase its staffing to make sure it progressed at the required rate. It published a workforce plan in December 2012, and in May 2013 the number of staff was about 15 behind plan, with around 374 staff in place and a number going through recruitment. Looking ahead, the Commonwealth Games Federation review in April 2013 concluded that overall progress is good. It flagged up a number of areas for action as the partners move into the delivery phase, including developing more streamlined, clearer and faster delegation and decision-making processes, and developing more detailed transport planning. We will continue to monitor progress, particularly through observing the 6-month Commonwealth Games Federation reviews. We're planning to carry out a further audit soon after the Games have taken place next year. This is likely to be reported in spring 2015, but the exact timing will depend on when the final costs of the Games are known. Thank you, Convener. We're happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much. And I mean, the report did seem to be largely positive, almost entirely positive, with progress made in the areas which the committee have expressed some concerns about before. I just wanted to ask one question really about one of the budget lines which the committee have discussed before, which is the general contingency fund, which on page 8 we can see has dropped from £71 million to £42 million, largely because of the transfer from that fund to the security budget, which I think in all fairness the committee had considered. The security budget had considered a bit of a risk before, and as you pointed out there's been quite a significant increase. But the contingency fund has now dropped quite a lot as well. And I just wondered, a straightforward question, whether you felt that the £42 million contingency budget was commensurate with the continuing risks which you've identified as we get closer to the games themselves.
As you say, Convener, most of the shift is related to the transfers to security and the capital contingency budget, and in broad terms you would expect the contingency to reduce as we get closer to the games anyway, as it's used for the costs that come up appropriately. I'll ask Tricia to give you an indication of whether we think it's where we'd expect it to be at this stage.
The information from the organising committee, they've looked at obviously progress against individual budget lines. They have identified some risks in some individual budget lines, about 3 or 4 areas where there's some risks that they may go over budget on those particular lines. Even totalling all that kind of worst case scenario up, it still comes within less than the contingency budget that's available. And the organising committee and the partners have made it clear that they want to look for savings elsewhere first before they would ever draw on the contingency. But even on those scenarios they've got at the moment, worst case, the potential overspends on the individual lines would still be affordable within contingency.
Okay, thanks very much. Mary.
Thank you. Could I just go to paragraph 29, page 11? I really don't know what you're trying to say here, but if I could just read it out. COCOM concluded the detailed transport planning is not as well progressed as it should be at this stage. I don't know, is it a week behind, 6 months behind? Is it a risk? Is it bad? Is it good? I don't know. This includes detailed requirements for public transport, procurement of buses and cars, and traffic and route management, including integration with games events. Now, I would have thought that the transport to the games is absolutely critical to the success, but I didn't find your wording very clear. Should we be concerned? I don't know. Can you perhaps give us some clarity and explain what you mean by planning is not as well progressed as it should be?
Sure. What we're doing there is reporting the results of the most recent COCOM review and their focus on planning. They certainly aren't highlighting it as an area which is of significant concern, but it is one of the areas that they've picked up as needing to be further advanced over the period that we're now entering. Tricia can give you more detail, I think, about the specifics of their review.
Yeah. COCOM were very clear that they want to see everything really, they use the phrase like locked down. They want to see all that detailed planning locked down by the time they're coming back to do their next review in October. So that's really the kind of critical point. There's so many interdependencies, so I think that's the point they were making, that you've got to have this clear to be able to move forward. So they did recognise that the partners had made a lot of progress over the past 6 months, and in terms of staffing, they've really prioritised getting people into the posts to move forward with the transport planning. But they were quite strongly making the point that they want to see further progress, and the next few months are quite critical in terms of making sure that happens.
So the planning, traffic planning is behind schedule, is that what you're saying?
Slightly behind, yeah. And
you feel that when they come back to us in October, it will be on schedule, is that what you're saying?
Yeah. That's the expectation.
That's what they're saying.
Yeah.
Because there's some quite big items here, procurement of buses and cars and etc. So you're quite confident that whatever slippage there's been in transport, that it can be corrected in time.
I think what we can tell you is that COCOM are confident about that.
They are confident.
Within the context of saying that overall progress is good, they've highlighted transport planning as an area that needs to pick up pace now, and they've given a very clear indication they expect to see it caught up to schedule by October this year. We'll keep a watching brief on that, but what we're able to do is to report to you their findings, and that's where they believe the picture is just now.
Sorry, if I can just ask, Convener, will we be getting another report? Will we be getting an update in this committee in October when the next review is done?
I think we're due a progress report in December. The Scottish Government, we'll get a Scottish Government progress report in December.
Okay, we'll look for it then. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Beattie.
I would agree with the convener that this report is a very positive one, and it looks like the project's being very well managed. I just had really one question to ask, which is on paragraph 18 in reference to private contract security. And of course, we've all seen the experience which is touched on here of the London Olympics, which are totally shambolic. Are they in time? Is this the right time for them to be doing this, or are they running a bit late on this? I mean, it takes time to tender, to get the contract, for the security company to recruit. We saw the shambles in London over recruitment, which extended over a period of months, and there seemed to be no redeeming point to it. Are we okay in terms of timing?
Sense is that timing is okay, and there is a lot to do between now and next July. Again, Tricia can give you a bit more detail of the texture of that.
Mm-hmm. Again, in discussion with Police Scotland, they've again highlighted the next 3 months as being quite critical in terms of getting all that detailed planning and planning for their procurement for security as well. So again, by September, October, we'd expect to see that really kind of really moved forward there.
Is it recognised that having more than one provider of security obviously raises certain risks as well in terms of areas of responsibility and physical presence and so on?
I think it is. I mean, clearly there's a trade-off to be had. In the case of the Olympics, we saw the risk of over-reliance on one contractor. You can manage that risk by having a number of contractors in there, but that requires more coordination and clearer communication. I think the view that we've picked up from both the organising committee and from COCOM is that those risks are understood. But as we say in the report, they all remain risks until the games are delivered.
And the question of getting more than one provider, they're not talking about one provider being responsible overall with subcontractors. It's actually two separate providers that they're looking for.
Understanding is more than one individual provider. Yeah, just given the experience from London.
Mr. Dornan.
Thank you, Convener. It does seem like a very good report. Everybody seems to be working well together and moving forward. Tenuously, the only issue I have, and it's really one for clarification, I think, is on page 15, Appendix 1, when you talk about Glasgow City Council's risk register, mitigating actions not being in place on their risk register, as this is not their policy, and they've previously made it clear they will not be implementing this recommendation. Can I ask, first of all, do we know why they won't do this? And secondly, is there any possibility that this will in itself create a risk?
I'll ask Tricia to pick up the detail of that one.
Thank you.
This has always been an issue. It's not to do with the identifying mitigating actions. They've done that. That's on their risk register. But it's the costing of mitigating actions, and that they've said to us right from the start that that's not Glasgow City Council policy. They don't do that at all. They don't cost mitigating actions. So they haven't done it here. The risks obviously are that we changed this to be clear that we were talking about risks that could have, or mitigating actions that could have potentially significant financial implications. Obviously, they don't know what these could be, and it's in terms of planning. So it's really an issue in terms of risk management.
Thanks for that. I'm a bit of a loss as to what it really means in practice then. I mean, is it possible that there's something that could cost money that because of the actions, say in this case of Glasgow City Council, but isn't going to be registered? And would that have a knock-on impact then on the other partners, or say, for example, on the delay in something happening in the run-up to the Games?
I think it would be more Glasgow City Council would be liable presumably for additional cost. So it's more to do with their financial management, that they could, you know, if something was to go disastrously wrong, then they could have to spend extra money. Obviously, venues have got to be ready, the city's got to be ready to deliver the games, that's a given. So
all the risk will lie with the council in terms of this?
In terms of the areas that they're responsible for.
Okay, okay, thanks for that.
Mr. Dornan.
Oh, sorry, convener, yes, I did say thank you.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you. I want to go to one of the key messages in the report on legacy. From an audit point of view, not from any other point of view, but from an audit point of view, the report says, quote, there is no specific funding for legacy. Now, from an audit point of view, does that matter?
I don't think it does as a fundamental point. The legacy could be achieved in a number of different ways, including from the investment that's going on now in the facilities and in the wider awareness of the Games. There's no given that specific funding would be required. That's just a factual statement.
So, indeed, I think that's logical. Why then is it on Glasgow City Council's risk register that the report mentions in Appendix 1?
Tricia, do you want to pick that up?
I think it's the Games is obviously an event that's taking place in Glasgow. Glasgow is putting lots of additional investment into facilities, into the Games. It's providing 20% of the overall public sector funding for the Games as well. So clearly Glasgow would want to see very specific benefits, legacy benefits coming through there. So there's specific Glasgow issues.
Indeed, but in your audit of them, or maybe there hasn't been a specific audit of Glasgow City Council in this respect, but in your audit of them, what are the risks that they identify?
I think it was just a fairly high-level risk, just around making sure that legacy, you know, the risk of the expected legacy benefits not being delivered, and then obviously the mitigating actions, the legacy plans that they've developed, the monitoring, the progress reports that they're producing. Yeah,
okay, but it's not really an auditable risk in that sense, is it? I mean, I'm struggling to see where the kind of financial audit is of legacy, given there's no numbers, there's no figures, there's nothing we as an audit committee can get our teeth into in that sense.
At this stage, it's one which isn't auditable, but after the Games it certainly should be. As we say, we think that the legacy planning has improved at this point in the run-up to the Games. We would expect that the outcomes and indicators that are being put in place by all the partners will start to be collected and measured. The monitoring that they have set out that they will be doing will start to take place, and after the Games it will be possible to make an assessment of what the legacy has been. As you would imagine, the legacy will be long-term, but at that point there should be a baseline from which to measure, and that's the point we're making here. Not necessarily that there is a specific financial aspect to that, although all of the investment that's going into the Games should also be contributing to the legacy as well.
And is that baseline you describe auditable? Is it financially auditable, or will it be financially auditable?
I'm not sure what it means to say simply financially auditable. We're auditing all the costs that are going into the Games, and we will be able to audit the outcomes and indicators that the partners are agreeing for legacy, and we can measure we can pull the two together as the basis for an assessment of the legacy against the spend.
Entirely fair. I mean, we just get lots of. I mean, I see outcomes till I'm blue in the face, and a lot of them are wonderful rhetoric and waffle, if I may say so, as opposed to being something that we can actually measure. So your judgment would be there'll be some in there that will be. That in 10 years' time, our future audit committee could come back and say, yes, legacy delivered this, X, Y, and Z.
Auditors are always very wary of saying in 10 years' time you can do this, but I think our assessment is at this stage the legacy planning has made good progress, and there is clarity about how the partners intend to assess their legacy.
Okay, thank you. And that paragraph in your report goes on to say, on legacy, strategic partners have aligned their existing initiatives to support legacy plans, and benefits are starting to be achieved. Are those benefits measurable from your judgment?
Tricia, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, some of them are, and even in our report from last year, we tried to put in some examples of the the tangible benefits that are already being seen, so the amount of money that's been through contracts going to Scottish-based companies, the number of apprenticeships, those kind of things, jobs created. So yeah, there's some quite tangible benefits.
Yeah, okay. And finally on this, convener, the report cites the economic climate as difficult, to, obviously, for both public and private organisations in terms of investing in long-term legacy. Do you have some specific examples of that? Are there some organisations, presumably to write that sentence, you know of organisations, both public sector and private sector, who haven't maybe been able to commit in the way in which they envisaged they might commit at an earlier stage? Is that what you're driving at there?
No, I think we were more just highlighting the risks around that, and given the economic situation, that there may be priorities other than legacy, but the games legacy, but through the approach that's been taken has been to try to integrate that to...
So that's more a general economic observation rather than a specific example of organisations that haven't committed. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr Doris.
Thank you, Convener. Apologies, I wasn't being discourteous, I was on my black, but I was trying to get a briefing paper from yesterday's debate in relation to Commonwealth Games and sport and legacy and that kind of thing, because I thought there were some figures in there that might kind of cross-reference. It was related to committee work. Now, you said there's no... I want to come back to baseline for legacy in a second, but you said there's no budget specific to legacy. But we get numbers all the time from the Scottish Government or Glasgow 2014. I just want to dig two of the most recent numbers out. So there's a £7.4 million capital investment fund for across Scotland for sporting facilities that communities can bid for as part of a legacy programme. So there's a budget line, and there's a £10 million budget called an Active Places Fund for 2014, again, which communities can bid for. Now, there's a whole cluster of different budget lines. There's a flurry of investment good news stories, if you like, that, as you'd expect government in Glasgow 2014 make a big play of when they're announced. That sounds like legacy to me. It seems as if we can identify numbers around money that has been invested for legacy, but it's not part of this audit process you're doing. Could you draw the distinction for me between how we would follow how that money has been used to promote legacy and how within this report you're saying there's not a specific budget line for legacy? Because I'm a little bit confused about that.
I think the starting point is that, as the report says, this isn't a formal audit report like the ones you normally get here. What we've done is to take the impact report we produce for our internal use after each report we publish and add to it with the information we've been able to gather from the COCOM review and other sources to give the committee an update as requested last year. We are planning to come back after the Games to pull all of that together and to give you that broad picture in ways that we'll be able to answer both your question and Mr. Scott's, but that I think is why you're seeing the picture you've got in this, just because of the nature of the work. Tricia, I think, may be able to give you a bit more of a picture around it.
I think in terms of the budget that we're looking at, there's no specific budget within that. This is the budget for delivery, but I think that's about integrating it into the broader, sort of broader outcomes, national priorities and outcomes for Scotland. So there's obviously been things that are related to legacy, and that's very much been the approach, I think, all through, has been to integrate where possible, to pick up on, to try to have national strategy relate to legacy where it can.
I find that really helpful, Convener, because I think what it's saying is there's a delivery plan and there's a budget in place for that, and there's legacy ambitions and aspirations that come with that, and the baseline, which I am going to come back to, but separate from that, there's other government money, and there's local authority money, and there's lottery money, monies which should be working in partnership with the 2014 delivery vehicle to get legacy. So how about those? It's about how those two knit together. So I think to anyone looking on that wasn't aware of the work of the audit committee, they might think there is no money for legacy. There's lots of money for legacy. It's just as part of this audit process, you're not considering that money. But in a future report, will you look to see how those monies, of which there's only two pots of cash that I've mentioned, how those monies that are being used to link to the 2014 progress report, how will that, is that something you will do?
Yes, as you say, what this progress report is doing is looking at the original Games budget, the way it's changed and how it's being managed towards July next year. We will then produce a report once the Games have taken place, first of all, which look at the outturn against that, and then which looks at the bigger picture in terms of the objectives that were set for the Games and the other funding streams that come into play. So we'll pick that up later on, but for now the focus is on the budget which is in place to deliver the Games, given the once-in-a-lifetime importance of getting that right.
So,
Sorry, Mr. Doris. But presumably what you're saying is these funds may be branded as part of the legacy, but they're not linked in any formal way to the delivery of the Games, in fact.
Right.
Is that right? So,
Exactly
so
right.
they don't form part of the audit that you've done. Doesn't mean they're not a good thing.
no, but absolutely, convener. But obviously, within some of the recommendations you have here, you're talking about being better aligned with local authorities across the country and their attempts to deliver legacy. And these local authorities across the country, together with the third sector and their voluntary sector, are bidding for all these other pots of cash, convener. So if they have to be better aligned and integrated with these other pots of cash that you're not actually auditing, what you will turn round to is to work to see how those two are knitting together at some point. But you won't actually be auditing the individual spend, but you will be auditing how those two things are knitting together. I'm just trying to be clear what you will or won't do going forward.
At this stage, our focus is very much on the Games delivery budget. The importance of getting that right, we all know, is very high indeed, and making sure that the risks are being managed towards next July is the focus of this. The legacy issue we will come back to later and look at the other funding streams which are available for it and the extent to which the legacy that they're achieving is matched to the plan for the Games itself and the wider impact on Scotland.
Perfect, thank you. I need to be careful I don't lurch back onto Health and Sport Committee territory again, because of course Health and Sport Committee, we look at this also in relation to legacy and other aspects. So it always seems a little bit like Groundhog Day on this committee, but there was discussions over how we get to a baseline. I would find it quite helpful if you could elaborate a little bit more on the types of things you would look for a baseline to be. For example, I was asking the Sports Minister in terms of, is it a baseline in terms of young people that are physically active across local authorities in 2008, 2009, and I see you're continuing tracking whatever baseline you pick until 2019, which I commend you for, because when the initial glow fades from the Commonwealth Games, you're still tracking through what legacy has or hasn't been. So could you give me an idea of the kind of baseline measures you're looking at? I would find that quite helpful.
I think all we can say is that we'll be looking at the baseline measures that the government, the partners and the local authorities across Scotland say they want to achieve. It's not our role to say this is the legacy that the Games should have. It is our role to say people were bidding for the money on the basis that they would increase participation rates. How has that happened? How much did it cost? What happened in practice? So we'll be starting with the measures and the indicators people said they wanted to monitor, and then looking at the change that's happened in those.
And I think I recall Sheila Robertson, MSP, saying they were still just firming up precisely the baseline measures and indicators. Is that your understanding as well? They're not quite there yet, or have they been established now?
They've issued an evaluation framework that does lay out in quite a lot of detail against the different legacy ambitions. What the indicators will actually be and where they will start to get some of that information. So some of it already exists. So some would be, percentage of people taking physical exercise. So there'll be baselines from whenever those surveys were done. Some of it is new information that will need to be collected. So a couple of weeks ago there was survey results of residents of the East End of Glasgow, their views on Games legacy, and that then gives a baseline that they can start to monitor against. So the framework is around the four flourishing, active, connected and sustainable, around the four legacy ambitions, and goes into a reasonable level of detail around the specific indicators under each of those headings.
I think I'm a little bit clearer on that, and I think I'm back on audit committee territory now, because those kind of things you mentioned are the kind of aspirational outcomes that we'll want to see under legacy. The baselines tends to be, okay, show me the data. Is this by doing a trawl of every swimming club via the via your national governing body? Is it doing with whatever sport, with athletics? Do you go to your sports clubs, use the national governing bodies? Do they assess the data? Do they get the baseline? You agree the criteria, you have your baseline. Is all that still in flux a little bit, is what I'm trying to establish? Not so much what we want to measure, but actually the brass tacks of how we're going to measure it.
Work has been worked out. So
Right.
so the framework says sort of where that information will come from, be it from published information that's already available, or from surveys that have to be done, or new information that has to be collected. So there has been, so that's been worked through. In terms of the Scottish Government's one, Glasgow's also been developing its own specific legacy framework. The legacy ambitions there are slightly different. They do track over, but they're kind of labelled slightly differently. It's developing its own framework, and that was just going through final approval processes.
I have to say it's a very good report. It's almost like seeking things to scrutinise to make sure we're doing our job properly. So one final thing, Mr. Dornan asked a really interesting question about overall risk register that Glasgow City Council has, which it does have rather, in relation to contingencies they may have to meet to mitigate should things go awry. And they said they have a policy not to cost that, and I thought Mr. Dornan might follow up on that. I'll just follow up just slightly, very restrained of him. I thought maybe just ask.
Yes.
Commendably restrained, yes, thank you, Convener. I'll consider myself discreetly chastised. Is that normal practice of local authorities? Is that best practice? Have you compared that with, let's say, other local authorities have done in the past with other major sporting events? Is that the done thing? Why wouldn't they do it?
We haven't obviously seen a sporting event on anything like this scale in Scotland, so I'm not sure there's such a thing as normal practice. We certainly think it would be good practice, and that's why we recommended it back in 2012. It is a matter for Glasgow City Council to make its own decision, but we think in terms of properly managing the risks that do arise, both in terms of the mitigating actions but also the potential costs associated with them, it would be good to include the costs in the register.
The
organising committee have done that on behalf for the sort of overall risk register, and the Commonwealth Games Federation did at their last review recognise that as being good practice in terms of knowing what the potential financial implications could be.
I'll now take the steer from my convener, and I'll leave it at
in fairness,
that,
it might be a point you could pursue in our next session, actually, when we're looking at the Accounts Commission report, which covers internal audit across local authorities, so it might be a place there to follow up.
Perfect.
Can I just come in a very restrained manner, Convener? Just on that last point you made, you said that the sort of overall risk register is taking everything into account, but it can't be taking everything into account if it doesn't have the available information from Glasgow City Council.
No, it would be, so the overall one is the risk that would apply across all the partners. So there's some things that would be just risks for individual partners, but the partners are looking at things that would apply across the piece.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Mr. Keir.
Thank you, Convener. It's actually the item on page 14 of the report talking about the strategic working, and I noticed in the 2011 report it said that although the overall governance was pretty well okay, the underlying was a bit fractured. Now we have this thing saying it's a flatter structure has been in place since December 2012. How difficult was that to achieve, and are we absolutely convinced that we have a management structure underneath the overall governance which is fit for purpose in terms of reviewing and the work that's been done?
The big point that came through from the Commonwealth Games Federation review was that we're now moving into a very different situation. So what was fit for purpose at the planning phase is not necessarily the same arrangements as will be fit for purpose in the delivery phase, because it's so much busier and there's so many more decisions that have to be made rapidly, and so many more people and contractors and different agencies involved. So their recommendation was very much that they need to now start thinking about what they need to be in place for that very busy delivery time, which starts kind of round about now. Tickets go on sale in August, the Queen's Baton really starts in October, so delivery does start this year. So they need to, again, be reviewing the governance arrangements and making sure that they are quick and responsive to that different situation that they move to. So there's a different issue about what's fit for purpose in the new phase.
But how difficult was it to do this? Was there any problems in refocusing these groups or reducing them? Any identifiable problems in the way that the structures had to be changed as you went through the weeks and months?
We haven't done a detailed audit at this time, but the partners didn't say that caused any particular difficulties. They've said that they've tried to adopt a fairly flexible approach. So as particular pieces of work finish, for example, then groups will be disbanded, and any kind of outstanding issues will pass on to another appropriate group. So it is a bit flexible as well, but they've tried to take on board the issue about tightening up terms of reference and delegated authorities.
No, it's just with a project that size. Yeah. I was just wondering if there was any practical stuff that could be learned for any future project. Yeah. Was there something that we could do that might stop any friction at the crossover points? Okay.
Okay, thanks. Mr. Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could ask a question about the ticketing strategy that's mentioned in the report too. Firstly, I'm pleased to see the pricing range for the tickets at £25 or less for 2/3 of the ticket sales, and the half-price tickets for under 16s over 60s. I also understand that there is no online booking fee charge being applied to the Commonwealth Games, and I'm delighted if that's the case, because many members might recall that if you're buying tickets online for whatever events that we attend, you normally attract a booking fee per ticket, which is really annoying for a lot of the public. But I'm pleased to see that's not the case here with the Commonwealth Games tickets. Can you tell me if the entire ticket sale, though, which does start on August the 19th, I think Tricia mentioned, is it entirely online, or are there tickets being made available through sports clubs, football clubs and others throughout Scotland, so that people can get them locally if they wish to? Do you have any information on that?
It's not something we're aware of. We'd certainly find out as part of our contacts with the partners and come back to you, but it's not something that we know at this stage.
Will be of interest, I think, to the Audit Committee, because with the London experience, the online system kind of almost crashed overnight whenever we tried to get tickets on the first day. That's not going to happen in this case. I think it's spread over the booking period, as I understand it. But I'd be keen to find out, Convener, just what the actual arrangements for distribution and access.
We have
you don't have to kind of be online within the first hour to get tickets.
No, you don't. And it's important that the public are made aware of that. But I'm interested if the tickets are being made available locally at all, or whether it's completely 100% online.
Yeah, we have a discussion later in private on how we take this forward, so it might be possible that we can try and pursue that.
Super. Could I ask a wee follow-up on Mary Scanlon's point about the transport? I mean, I think what will be different with the Commonwealth Games in terms of the transport pattern, there'll be huge numbers of individual journeys, I think, to Hampden for the Commonwealth Games, rather than busloads of clubs arriving and so on that you get at a football match. And I'm reminded when Pope Benedict came to Scotland, the M77 was set aside as a car park to service the Bellhausen Park there, which was absolutely essential in the day. And if anyone knows Hampden, you know that there's really not very much parking. There's not much parking in and around at all for buses or cars. So I'm hopeful that the transport strategy, when it does more of its work, will make these kinds of issues clear, so that people can get to and from Hampden, not just from within Glasgow, but from elsewhere in Scotland, conveniently and convenient drop-off points. So I think, Convener, would look forward to seeing more details on that as that rolls through, and perhaps in the autumn.
There's a focus on using public transport, about really integrating public transport with games ticketing. So I think one of the plans is that when you get your ticket for an event, that would also give you free public transport to get to that event as well. So again, that's part of the detailed planning that they need to work through, is exactly how that all works. So, but things to very much encourage use of public transport.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey, and thank you for resisting the temptation to tell us again about your relatively recent visits to Hampden. I think you'll find. I think you'll find I've been there more recently than you have.
What's the result?
With less success.
We've been more successful though.
Yeah. Any members want to come in and follow up? I think.
The next time you want to visit Hampden, let me know in advance.
Okay. Thanks very much, Mr. Durham. Thank you very much to the Auditor General and to Tricia Meldrum. We'll suspend for a couple of minutes just to allow a change of witnesses. Thank you. Goodbye, we can start again. What's wrong? Okay, we're back in session now, and item 3 on our agenda is responding to challenges and change, an overview of local government in Scotland 2013, and this is a briefing from the Accounts Commission. So we have with us John Bailey, Chair of the Accounts Commission, Fraser McKinlay, Controller of Audit, and Gordon Small, Portfolio Manager. Gordon Smale, Portfolio Manager at Audit Scotland. And we have apologies, I think, from Douglas Sinclair, who I believe has given evidence to another committee, so hasn't been able to be with us. Yes, indeed. Just to remind members that, of course, the performance of individual local authorities is out with the committee's remit, so the purpose of this session is to assist us with the series of joint Auditor General Accounts Commission reports on national developments which we've been considering. So with that, I'll hand over to Mr Bailey to introduce the report.
Thank you, Convener. I have a short opening statement. Sessions such as this are now an established part of the Accounts Commission's work. We welcome the opportunity to discuss the challenges facing councils with the committee. Previous overview reports identified the pressures facing local government. This year our report focuses on how councils are responding and what more needs to be done. And councils are managing their finances in challenging economic circumstances, and so far they are coping well. Among the many changes they face, councils are placing due importance on the significance of welfare reform and its implications for people and communities. There are good examples of partnership working, but there is a long way to go before the full potential of community planning is realised. Overall, councils face tougher challenges and more change in the years ahead. Our report identifies key recommendations that the Commission believes, if implemented effectively, will make a real difference to councils' prospects. We set these out on page 4 of our report, grouped under 4 headings, being leadership and governance, working in partnership, service changes, and performance information and management. Achieving best value is crucial. As our report says, and as we have been saying for a number of years now, councils that place best value at the centre of all they do are well placed to deal with the challenges and change. We are, of course, happy to take any questions that the committee may wish to ask. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. I wanted Mr Bailey just to ask a question on paragraph 26 of the report. This comes at the end of a short section on welfare reform as one of the key challenges which local government faces, and you mentioned that in your remarks there. Paragraph 26 says, it's difficult to overstate the potential implications of welfare reform on people and communities and council services and their policy objectives and on council staff. I just wondered, accepting that it may be difficult to overstate it, if you'd be willing to make some sort of statement about the kind of potential implications that you believe local authorities might face. The section doesn't really elaborate that. It goes through some of the changes which will have an impact, but I just wonder if you have any sense of the scale of this challenge.
I'll ask Gordon Smale in a second to comment on the detail behind your question. It's fair to say, though, that councils have tried hard to address the challenges that clearly welfare reform presents. Gordon, do you want to take up the...
Yes, thank you, Mr Bailey. I think in the report, what we've done right up front is flag this as one of the major issues, one of the critical things we see that's important for local government to deal with over the next few years, and it's certainly up there as one of the biggest changes they've faced in the last 10 years or so. It's an area we've been monitoring closely, and we've been giving reports to the Accounts Commission from Audit Scotland on the progress that's been made. And what we're finding is that councils are taking this issue very seriously. They're working well together and with COSLA to find ways of dealing with the known part of this. I think one of the challenges of our councils is that some of the detail that's still to unfold from this is not quite clear to them, and I think that's a particular issue for them. In terms of specifics, I think there are things around council staff, for example, what's to be expected of councils and their
in their role in managing the new arrangements and overseeing them and helping people through the new arrangements. And I think part of it is that unknown. I think, as Mr Bailey said, councils are aware of what they need to do just now. I think there's some uncertainties as to what they'll be expected to do as the years unfold. I think there are also implications in terms of things, quite far-reaching things beyond the implications for the communities that councils serve, but also in terms of some of the management issues that councils face around, for example, council house building programmes, where they perhaps had to reassess some of their plans to perhaps move towards building homes that have got smaller units, one-bedroom units, so that these fit more with what people need to, what people are looking for, and what would be better for them under the new arrangements in terms of the number of bedrooms and properties. So I think the overall picture is very far-reaching consequences, but still quite a bit of uncertainty for councils about what all this will mean.
So, I mean, I accept that a lot of the changes are just coming in or haven't actually come in yet, so it may be difficult to work out what the scale of the challenge has been and how well the response is working. So my question, I suppose, is what plans do the Accounts Commission have to monitor and to report on the effect on local government of these changes?
This is a big ticket item, if I can put it that way. This is something we'll be monitoring in conjunction with Audit Scotland on a fairly regular basis. It's just too important not to keep an eye on it as it develops. As you say, there are a lot of uncertainties in this, and we really just need to have very regular monitoring.
When do you envisage being able to make some kind of public assessment of the position? Funnily enough, we're about to discuss this in the not too distant future. I would say by this time next year we should have a fairly clear idea of the initial effects of it. But it's, I suspect it's one of those issues that for every question that we ask and find out information about, there are several others begged. I think it's going to be that kind of exercise by the very nature. Mr McKinley.
Thank you, Convener. If I can just come in there, as Gordon mentioned, we've already done a bit of baseline survey work with councils to assess their preparedness for the changes coming in, and that went to the Accounts Commission and is on the website a couple of months ago, which gave us a pretty positive picture, I think, about where councils were in terms of their planning and preparedness for it, and as Gordon said, the seriousness with which they are taking it. I would absolutely expect it to continue to figure in this report, which is an annual report, and it may be that in time it gets a bit more coverage and we can say more about the actual impact as we are seeing it. As well as that, we are supporting the Accounts Commission and the Auditor General as we look forward to the Performance Audit Programme in 14-15 and beyond. Welfare reform is a strand in that, and one of the things we have to think about is how best to get at welfare reform, because you could either do it as the impact of welfare reform, or you could get at the implications of welfare reform through individual policy areas and services. So it's very much in the centre of our thinking, and we need to figure out how best to get at it and report it.
Okay, thanks very much. Mr Beattie.
Thank you. I'm a little bit concerned about the comments on CPPs. If you look at paragraph 37, I'm looking at the statement, there is a long way to go before the full potential of community planning will be realised. And then over the page in Exhibit 6, the third bullet point, community planning partnerships are not yet able to demonstrate they've had a significant impact in delivering improved outcomes across Scotland. Now, I've heard this in previous reports that have come before this committee. Is there any indication at all of that improving? I mean, these are major initiatives, and we can't show that they're actually delivering?
I think where we are with it is that for a long time now, community planning partnerships, frankly, not able to demonstrate delivery. It's only in the last 2-3 years that there's been a much greater focus and emphasis on the need for CPPs to be the core of delivery to the community. And it's in that context that those findings that you see in Exhibit 6 are made. As you know, we produced some work on this not so long ago, and it's fair to say that the observations we made, the findings, and the recommendations have been accepted by, for example, a national community planning group that oversees the progress and the improvement towards much better delivery of all the services that community planning partnerships are required to oversee and ensure are delivered. So there's I think we're at the start of a journey here. There are some very specific things in community planning partnerships that stand out a mile as needing addressed. As our report said, everything is a priority in CPPs, and so nothing's a priority, so we need to reduce the priorities. Likewise, there's a need for a much greater definition of role and responsibilities of members of communities, and within that there needs to be a proper and robust holding to account by members of each other, rather than thinking of it as not their day job and they can go back to base and get on with that. So I'm sorry, I'm beginning to go on too long, I realise, but there's such a long way. That's what we mean when we say there's a long way to go.
No, that's helpful, but I've no feel as to how long this journey is going to take before we start understanding whether CPPs are actually fit for purpose and delivering. We may be at the start of a journey, but you were talking about the last 2 or 3 years things have been sort of moving forward. I mean, are we talking in terms of years to know whether this is actually they're actually going to deliver?
Well, our audit programme envisages doing another five in the next year, for example. That will give us a pretty good critical mass of what community planning partnerships are looking like. And all the while, the national CPP group, which, as you know, is a joint exercise by Scottish Government and COSLA, is looking at how to engage with specific partnerships and address their particular issues and help them improve via the improvement service. So there's a lot of activity going on under the water on this. I don't know, Fraser, if you want to add to that.
Just a little bit, Chair, thank you. I think the next couple of years are going to be absolutely key to seeing whether the step change in performance around community planning that everyone agrees is required and is committed to is actually taking place. The Scottish Government and COSLA, as the Chair says, have genuinely set out a pretty bold vision for community planning. That came out at the start of 2012 in the Statement of Ambition. The new guidance for single outcome agreements that came out in December 2012 again sets a very clear expectation that that bit of the process needs to really move on. So there has been a real upping of the game, if you like, over the last, as John said, year or two in terms of what expectations of community planning are. So in the next year or two, and we'll be continuing our audit work in this area, we would expect to see that difference really coming through. That's not to say that outcomes will be transformed in the next 2 years, but in terms of the operation of community planning, we would absolutely expect to see a difference in the next couple of years.
I guess what concerns me is we seem to be talking in terms of years and years and years here. I mean, you've said improvement over the last 2 or 3 years. We might see some significant changes over the next couple of years. It seems a heck of a long time to actually see anything coming through.
And we would agree with that. The reason we said that in the original report was that community planning has been around for a long time. It was a statutory duty since 2003. In a sense, and we report audit, particularly through best value audits, but it's not a new thing, and therefore there is, I think, a reasonable expectation that they should have been further on. I guess what we're seeing now is a real re-energising of that process and it looking quite different and moving on again. But I think if there isn't real evidence in the next couple of years, then we need to be asking some pretty fundamental questions about it.
And just one other thing just to finish with, on paragraph 67 and 70, there is reference again to lack of consistent data, which seems to be a recurring theme with most audit reports. Is there any sign of improvement?
On the data itself, it's one of the major points we made in the other report to which you referred. I think there's a lot of work going on. Whether it's, I can't honestly say there's been a lot of improvement as of yet, but I do know there's a lot of activity going on under the surface to try to get performance measurement much more ably introduced and embedded in CPPs, and it's something that I think the Improvement Service is actively engaged in as well. As you may know, just as an aside, but it's relevant, I think, we worked with Solace to introduce a suite of performance measures for councils to ensure better comparison around Scotland. The hope is, in due course, I can't commit to a date because I don't know how long they'll take. But the hope is in due course that something similar might eventually be available for CPPs. But that could take time.
I wonder, Convener, if CPPs are something we could come back on as a committee, because this is a big initiative and it's a major piece of what's happening in local government.
I mean, I think to a degree it is on our agenda, and it's something that we've raised with Audit Scotland before, although in terms of significant piece of work, we're kind of in the Auditor General's hands. But I think
skills we're talking about to see something coming through.
I mean, I think we may have some follow-up to some of the previous reports due at some point. So perhaps that's something we could write to the Auditor General and clarify. Because I think it is the case that when the report came through, there was a lot of concern about the degree to which it wasn't possible to really find any evidence that CPPs had been effective at all. Yeah, let's follow that up. Okay, Mr. Scott.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just, on the same theme, isn't the basic problem with community planning partnerships that A, they're called community planning partnerships, not community delivery partnerships, and therefore the members of those CPPs take a particular attitude to it, which I think, in fairness, Mr. Bailey, you've hinted at. And secondly, elected members feel aggrieved about the fact they sit there as elected members under the principle of democracy, and everyone else on those is an appointee of some organisation or other who's got no democratic legitimacy whatsoever. So quite understandably, elected members think, well, okay, but I carry the can here because I'm accountable to local people. Isn't that the inherent difficulty and challenge of these bodies?
I think there are a number of issues around definition of who does what and when and who's responsible. One of the big issues is, of course, the budgets and do they have a budget? Can they contribute their budget to the planning partnership rather than to their base back home, whether it's health or social care or whatever? And at the last meeting of the national group, that kind of issue was discussed. There's a long way to go there in terms of getting any solid agreement. But again, I think there's a lot of discussion going on under the surface about it. Do you want to add anything to that, Fraser?
I think the point about planning is well made, and certainly the experience of the first 10 years of community planning is that at best they try and align their plans as individual partners. That is one of the things that has changed in terms of the expectation. There needs to be much more a genuinely integrated plan for that place, where all the partners are involved from the roots up, if you like, in delivering and planning and then arranging for the delivery of that plan. I don't think there's an expectation that the community planning partnership at the top level will be the delivery agency, but the statement of ambition is clear that it needs to provide an overarching framework for the delivery, and everyone needs to be heading in their same direction to deliver the outcomes for that community. Your point about elected members touches on the kind of core thing that we mentioned in this report and in other places around accountability of partnerships. And the people around the table have different accountability mechanisms which are not easy to reconcile sometimes, is the reality of that. The Scottish Government have said that they will look to bring in new powers, new legislation around accountability and the statutory powers for different partners and the partnership itself, which will move on along a bit from a power around participating in planning to something around a power or a duty to deliver outcomes for the local community. So the expectation is that will be coming through in bits of legislation in the next 18 months or so. So again, I think they recognise that issue, and in the meantime, the expectation is that they should be doing this differently.
Indeed, but when I was a councillor, the debate was about, and this is not yesterday, but the debate was about a power of general competence and all-purpose authorities. And my question, I guess, is, have we not just completely reconfigured local government now, because they're now seen, if you pardon this, as by national government as a equal partner of all these other agencies who, I repeat the point, do not have any democratic legitimacy. So elected members again, and a council who are there and elected to be there, see themselves being diminished, see their central role in their areas being effectively dumbed down by this process. And not unsurprisingly, members kick back at that. Isn't that the reality of why these things, I mean, I share Colin Beattie's concerns that these things are not working. They're just not, because they're not seen as absolutely number one job. The number one job of an elected member is the full council meeting every 6 weeks. It's not the CPP, even for senior members. So this will never change, I think, until that central issue is grasped.
That's really why I was concentrating on the money. The attention will follow the money, and if the money is firmly committed to something, then there's a lot of things follow from that. And I take your point entirely about local democracy and parity of esteem and all the things that go with that. But the essence of it is trying to get people to work together, almost regardless of that. And I guess that's part of your point, how difficult is it to get them to work together when the formal structures effectively set them apart a little?
Look, it's not your job, I absolutely appreciate, to make policy, but would it not be fair to say, and put it the other way around, would it not be fair to say that until, as it were, money is on the table of whatever CPPs are called or become, then this will continue in the way in which we meet on an annual basis to discuss it? Isn't that the reality of the situation?
Well, I think lots of people within CPPs and those responsible for trying to improve performance recognise the importance of money being a key point, and once that is resolved in whatever way, then things should flow much more fully as a consequence of that. I would go that far with you, if you like.
And would it be fair to say, if we did go down that route, again, if policy was made in that way, from an audit point of view, it would be perfectly legitimate to audit that if, for example, government changed the manner in which CPPs operated so that some budgets did align to and directly with a CPP, there would be no problem auditing that, would there? There would be perfectly clear audit lines.
To a large extent, the policy is set around this because the statement of ambition is clear that partnerships should be looking at the phrase as the totality of their resources that are available in that area. So they've set out that expectation very clearly. And it's one of the things that, as I was saying to Mr. Beattie, that this will be one of the big tests for us in the next 12 months to see whether there's any evidence of that really happening. Because I agree, I think if they were to focus on one thing that is really going to make a difference, it needs to be about the money. That's the point at which minds are really focused. And really importantly, not the money in a kind of sterile, what's your budget look like way, money in terms of what does that mean for our collective resources and people and buildings, and how are we actually using them in the community. That's the kind of conversation that partnerships haven't been having and really now need to have. So to that extent, I think the policy is clear, and our job and the Commission's job and the Auditor General's job, because obviously this includes health and other partners too, is to hold the mirror up and say to what extent are you actually achieving that.
Mr. Keir.
Thank you, Convener. My question is actually based around paragraph 106, and it's relating to workforce-related financial pressures. Equal pay, a rather long-running chestnut in local authorities, and I was wondering if you could tell us if you've managed to identify through issues of best practice and the likes, you know, are councils, local authorities as a whole managing this problem in the best possible way, because it's obviously a huge issue for them.
Can I ask Gordon to take that up?
Yeah, it is a big issue, and one that's, as I think you're pointing out, is not going away. It's certainly something we've been monitoring for a long time, and the figures that are involved are quite substantial. Something of the order about so far about £600 million that councils have paid out or are planning to pay out. Our job as auditors is really to look at how things have been accounted for there. There's a long-running history about single status and then equal pay and how that's all come through. But we're looking very close to that as part of the individual audits we do of councils. So what does that mean in practice? That involves auditors asking councils if they've identified a figure for what they still believe they have to pay out or where they're still exposed to further claims, that these have been properly recorded through the accounts. And that involves auditors challenging people like the legal people in councils, asking them, how are you making the assessment? How up to date is that assessment? Are you aware of these continuing legal cases that are going on, and what the implications are for the finances of your council? So in short, it's an area that we continue to monitor through the accounts and make sure that the proper disclosure, proper accounting and proper disclosure is made in the annual accounts.
Could I add, we also have a report coming out later this year on workforce capabilities and movements. And I think, am I right in saying that's going to touch on this as well?
I think it will acknowledge that this has been a big issue. If you're going to do a bit of work, a bit of audit work around workforce and workforce planning, you wouldn't be able to do something like that without reflecting on equal pay. I don't think it will get down into the kind of detail that people might expect. We've been really interested in making sure that the accounting and disclosure and public information is available as best as possible.
Has it been possible to identify the individual councils who are handling this better, worse, who has the best method of accounting for these problems? How easy is it for you to identify through these processes who's actually doing a decent job and who's really having problems?
I'd say the short answer to that is it's actually very difficult for us. The experience has been that some of the councils that were seen to be first, if you like, reportedly first to have actually resolved this, are ones that are finding that there are still problems coming back to them because of the ongoing legal cases, redefinitions of things as they go through the courts and the like. So I think the short answer is it's very difficult for us to get some grasp on who's doing it well and who's not. It seems to be shifting, and I suspect my feel is there's a lot more to come in this.
Can I just follow up on that, Convener? Thank you. I think, as it happens, we are meeting with all local government auditors this week. We meet all local government auditors twice a year, and the process, as you know, is that all auditors in October report to me as Controller of Audit, and I report on to the Accounts Commission about issues that have come up, and equal pay is always something that auditors will look at. And what I'm going to be saying to auditors on Friday is we need to look at it again and closely. And I think that I think our sense is we're at a point now where the councils have just about been managing it, and to kind of keep a lid on it, I think there's a different question about the extent to which equal pay and single status has done what it was originally designed to do, which was to modernise pay and grading and how that all works. So I think, in answer to your question, Mr. Keir, in terms of to what extent are people doing it well, it depends on what we mean by the question. If we think they're managing the problem of equal pay, then I think they're just about managing that, and some are doing it better than others. If there's a question about to what extent has single status and equal pay modernised arrangements for workforce management in councils, is a different kind of question. So, and as you say, we are now, this is a regular conversation that we're having, so I think we're at a place now of thinking how we can move that on a little bit.
And it could be assumed that there's several more years of this to go.
Well, as Gordon refers to, one of the issues is the continuing case law and precedent that comes up, which does quite significantly change the landscape for all councils and across the UK. It's a very big and complex legal area that does continue to shift and move on. So just when you think you've dealt with one thing, something else crops up and there's a whole different set of issues to deal with. So it's a very difficult thing to keep track of.
Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Convener. Just a question on reserves. I know from the report, like you say, reserves have been increasing, but you do mention in your report the pressure of our incoming administration and their manifesto commitments from an election. Have you got any indications of reserves being squeezed at all in the past year to meet any of those commitments?
Gordon, do you want to take that?
We've been tracking this very closely, as you say, over a number of years, and the overall position is that they've gone up again. I think there are a number of reasons why they have increased, due to things like there's elements of underspending. I think councils have perhaps seen the benefits of staff reductions coming through a bit more quickly. But in terms of your specific question, there's no evidence that a consequence of elections and manifestos are actually, we can't make a link between one and the other, in other words.
Another point on reserves as well was that you note that in some cases councils haven't reviewed their reserves policies. Just to ask whether you've been in touch with councils, whether you'd be given advice on that, particularly with some of the welfare reform changes that have been mentioned earlier, and the impact that will have on councils' ability to generate income through council tax receipts and rental income.
Do you want to keep going?
Yeah, I'll just continue. Thank you. The issue about policies is very important, and in fact the work the Commission's done over the years has actually got this whole issue about reserves really up front in the minds of people, and we've got a lot better information than we've ever had before on that. And one of the consequences of that is that councils now have on the whole, and in fact all of them have written policies. The question is just how up to date it is, how far do they reflect the current circumstances that are there. This is a thing because of the interest of the Commission, and as Fraser was saying, through our auditors. This is something that local auditors ask councils each year, and will continue to press to make sure that policies are up to date. Part of the story in here, of course, is just more transparency around why councils have got reserves and what are they going to do with them. And I think there's still more ground needed, particularly in an environment where, with all the pressures that are on finances, it just doesn't, you know, there's an explanation needed to be made for councillors and for the public as to why reserves are continuing to increase.
Sorry, my apologies. Mr. Coffey next.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wanted to ask a question about the shared services agenda. Mr Bailey, you mentioned it in the report briefly there, and you also say that you don't expect significant savings to be made in the short term through the shared services agenda there. And there's an interesting exhibit on page 12 there. It shows a kind of mixed picture, I would say, where some of the councils have decided not to proceed with a shared agenda because of political differences, perhaps, but and others perhaps because of administrative gain and so on. So, firstly, do you think we're doing enough, or the Council's doing enough to progress the shared services agenda? And with new burdens and obligations coming down the line, like integration of health and social care, police and fire, welfare reforms, and perhaps even community justice, because I think that is held up as an option that could go to local councils. So, when new burdens arrive, do you think they're doing enough at that point to develop a shared service agenda from the start, which might yield the savings that are not being given to us through, you know, separation or integration of services that have been there for a long time?
Could I start by saying any time I think of shared services, I take one step back and think of options appraisal on the basis that, as you well know, shared services is one choice available to councils in delivering the service. But the first stage, and the Commission's on record on this, is for us to say, is this the right choice to make? First of all, if it is, then let's look at it, and off we go. And I think once you get there, it's fair to say there's been quite a lot of effort put in to looking at possibility of shared services in various ways around the country. We looked at what was causing this to progress far more slowly than anyone was reasonably expecting, and a lot of it is down to ceding control. That if you have a nicely run operation, why would you cede control to, or some of that, to somebody who's perhaps not got quite the same reputation, or whatever? It might just be human nature. I don't want to share this because I'm in control of it, and if I lose control of it, we're back to budgets again, etc. And so there's a general issue there about the genuine willingness to look at it. For that reason, among many others, there are many other complications. I don't know, Gordon, do you want to add to the shared services point?
Certainly, again, it's something, one of the advantages of this report is we can track over time and kind of repeat messages. Shared services have been in the report for a number of years now, and I think it's right that we flag up the lack of progress that there's been, quite frankly, in some of the large-scale shared services that have been attempted, and these are highlighted in Exhibit 8 of the report, some of them. I think our sense is, from what we see, is that there are so many barriers put up in terms of the large-scale type of shared services. In fact, the Commission and the Auditor General made a submission to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee's inquiry into this back in January, and identified 3 particular areas where there were barriers around the financial aspects of it, the workforce aspects of it, and organisational things, which are to do with things like leadership and the like. So if that's on that side, where all the barriers are, I think there are some positives in this, and moving away from the large-scale shared services type of initiatives, and that is looking at how things at a kind of lower level can work well. And we've got this phrase in the report, moving away from economies of scale to economies of skill, and I think that captures it quite well, because we see good examples of, particularly around some of these very specialist professional services, where councils are linking up together in a, perhaps not in a formal sense, but in a way that they can share expertise in some of these areas which I guess are some of the areas that are being most squeezed, because they're not seen as being, you know, they're not in the social work, not in the education areas, some of the regulatory areas, where that joining up and just joining together in a kind of loose way that doesn't have all the formality and all the, you know, all the direct interest, if you like, in it, working well.
I'm getting the impression that more could be done. Just take, for example, the community justice, you know, and, if that were to happen, surely, to goodness, we're not going to get, I think we've got 8 at the moment, I think, is it 8 community justice authorities? Surely we're not going to get 32. You know, that'd be unthinkable, surely. I mean, there must be some work and planning and thinking going on at the moment for that possibility to have some shared service provision within the authorities for that particular service, which will be a new burden for councils, perhaps in the next couple of years.
I don't know how you need to say on that, Fraser.
I mean, I know that there is a lot of thinking going on around the future of community justice and community justice authorities, which I'm not that close to, Mr. Coffey. But I think in the wider sense, there is an interesting discussion and debate to be had about whether things should be more decentralised or more centralised in terms of service delivery. And I think there's probably no right model for everything. I think it's probably on a horses for courses kind of approach you would want to consider those. So I would expect that to be part of the discussion around CGAs and other bits of services.
Could I just go back to the point that Gordon Smale was making? That I think it seems to us that, having observed councils trying quite hard on many occasions to group together services with another council or series of councils, and in a sense they address all the barriers as they have to at the start, before there's any genuine working relationship or trust. And it's not inevitably, but it's more likely to run into difficulties as a consequence. If you start small and grow and build the trust as you go, then I think there's much more of a chance of succeeding.
That aspect's probably more of interest to our local government colleagues, convener. Could I ask a brief second question on the prudential borrowing framework? You mentioned that at the end of the report, and I just wonder if you have a view on whether we have used it to best effect in local government. I mean, this is the best time, you would imagine, ever for interest rates for councils to borrow for capital investment, and do you think we're using it as effectively as we could do?
As you know, the Prudential Code in essence says that if you can demonstrate sustainability of interest and repayment, then everything's acceptable. We are just a little bit concerned about whether the Prudential Code is at a stage where it may need revisiting to perhaps be clearer, to perhaps be more specific, or whatever. As for the interest rates, as long as today's rates are the ones in force, if you can get a creditor to agree today's rates for 10 or 15 years, then I think councils would bite your hand off. But I'm not sure that that's necessarily something you could get today. Gordon, do you want to?
Just to say, I think Mr. Coffey makes a very good point, and it's one that we highlight in the report here. The Prudential Code was brought in about 2004. The world's moved on substantially, and even this very high-level analysis we've done for this report to try and give a sense of how things have shifted across the 32 councils shows a very wide variation. And I think the time is right just to look back and say, is that code still fit for purpose? It might well be, but I think it would be good if we were looking at that and get the confidence that it is, because many decisions we made in councils on a daily basis with reference from officers to members about the indicators in the code. So we should make sure that they're absolutely fit for purpose in the current environment.
The council's asking for more flexibility in terms of the code to allow them to.
Well, I think they're looking at the code, the parameters that the code provides. whether or not, you know, that if you look at some of the indicators that would indicate whether it's sustainable and affordable, whether or not that some of these boundaries are being pushed a wee bit as councils look to drive on with some of these capital projects that they need to undertake, or where money may be short in other areas. And I think that's why it's absolutely crucial at this stage in local government finance that the code is looked at again, and the Commission have started to put that in train through this report, and we'll take that on through Audit Scotland with people like SIPFA.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr Guffey. Mr Dornan.
One of the things that comes out loud and clear from this is that the job of councillors has changed over the years and is changing still and becoming much more complex. Given some of the issues that we've talked about in the report, the welfare reforms, CPP, the financial difficulties, economic difficulties that we all face just now, and, for example, the relationships with allies, do you think that maybe between COSLA and Solace, for example, there could be a message sent out to councillors about the importance of adequate training? I know the training is available there. I also know that many councillors are very good at going to the training and do everything. But particularly with senior councillors, I think that very often senior councillors are selected based on, and I say this as somebody who was a group leader in the council, based on political basis as opposed to their ability to do the job. Now, that doesn't mean they won't be able to do it, but do you think that there's a role there to sell the importance of the adequate training, which is available in almost all, certainly in the Glasgow City Council where I was, to the councillors?
I couldn't agree more with you. I think training and development is absolutely essential. As you say, the role of councillors now is so broad and it's so busy. You know, it seems to me almost a 24-hour day job at times, and it's getting the time. For example, to scrutinise properly, you've got to know the subject matter, but then you've got to, within that, you've got to start looking at things in depth to be able to eke out the real story. Sometimes that takes time. There's no way around it, and so that is it. So managing time alone is something that I think councillors would benefit from, because it's a very difficult job. I couldn't agree with you more, though, that on specific topics, every bit of training that's available should be taken up, and probably a lot more as well. But it's the time again. How do you break this circle of business on a daily basis and time out to train? It's a very difficult one, but we would support anything to do with encouraging training and improvement.
I'm just wondering, as I say, if maybe the method of that is to get COSLA and Solace to sort of sell the importance of this, and particularly, again, I go back to the senior councillors, and it may well be that if you're selecting somebody for that, then what you have to do is you have to take them from some other things that they're doing and give them the time to get the training, because I can think of some major offices where I would suggest that the person who took the office wasn't ready for it at that time.
I think there are two aspects. One for me is having a detailed development plan on an individual basis, and the other is the extent to which officers can support development of councillors. I think those two things together, if they were done much more, would see a benefit. I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything to that.
Only to add to the people that are involved in this, the Improvement Service have actually set up quite good web-based training for councillors. But I think the only thing I would add is just to link it to the previous question. Some areas that councillors deal with are very complicated. Local government finance, by its very nature, is complicated. And to be able to ask the right questions as part of the scrutiny process is absolutely vital. And that's not just about that top-line question as to why is this going up or down. It's to be able to, to know the subject matter, to go to the supplementary that follows that. Because, council officers, I think good council officers welcome scrutiny, because that's what makes the decision-making process more robust and gets the ownership that you need throughout the council officers and members as things are taken forward. It's vitally important in my view.
Thank you. Can I just ask on that point, James Dornan, the Appendix 1, the action point for councillors, in your monthly meetings with councils, do you ask how well this has been implemented, or what assurances do you have that this will lead to better training, etc.?
We would always part of the process is that when we publish this overview report, the local audit teams would pick up the recommendations, and we would expect this report to go to the relevant committee, usually the kind of audit or scrutiny committee in a council. And certainly at the end of the audit year, we look at the extent to which these questions are being looked at and considered and implemented, and then that informs. So we gather all of that from across all 32 councils, and that informs the subsequent overview report. So there is a kind of annual follow-up cycle in place there that helps us keep an eye on it.
I do appreciate that this is an overview, and I do appreciate that, as Willie Coffey said, many of the questions are for local government. But I did actually go through the report boringly, and I found quite a few issues that were mentioned, and I didn't quite know if they were a problem or not. So you have to forgive me, because I then looked at the recommendations, which were actually very general. The recommendations could pretty well apply any time, any place, any year. So if you'll forgive me, I'll just go through the points that I picked up. Paragraph 45. Reviews need to include discussions with local partners to identify. The first one, is there a need for a service? Now, are you implying that councillors actually are providing a service without determining whether or not there's a need for that service? Otherwise, why is it there? Surely no services are being delivered if there's no need for them.
Well, I think that's, I'm not sure we would be wholly confident to say that's the case. I think the reality is that if you look at...
Some services are being delivered with no need identified.
No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying that the council should ask themselves the question. And the answer to that may well be yes, it is needed, but I think they should ask themselves the question.
So are you saying that they're not currently asking themselves that question? They're just gaily delivering services without actually asking whether there's a need for them?
I think in the last couple of years they have started to ask themselves those questions again. I think the reality is that when you look at what's happened in terms of funding available to local government over the last 10 years, services have increased, and it may not be a service wholesale, but maybe it's the way in which a service is delivered, maybe it's the extent to which a service is delivered. So I think it's unlikely that there is an activity that local government does which you would just want to cut completely, although in recent months there has been a couple of instances where councils have taken those kinds of decisions. But the reality is that the financial pressure that they are now facing in the last few years has taken them to a place of asking more fundamental questions. One chief exec I spoke to as part of the run-up to this report last year, the way she characterised it was there are now things being brought to the table at budget time that just would never have been brought to the table. So there are more fundamental questions being asked, and we think that's a good thing. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that there are services out there that shouldn't be delivered.
It's just quite incredible that as the Audit Commission for Scotland, that you have to write in a report recommending that councillors and council officials ask themselves whether there's a need for a service. However, I come on to point 2, which is paragraph 80, effective risk management, and you say these require a shift in the culture and attitude to risk. I don't know what you quite mean there. What's wrong with the culture and attitude to risk in councils? Because it's not clear.
And so one of the things we're trying to do with this report is to paint that overall context. And the phrase we're using in the report is to be risk aware, not risk averse. I think the view may be taken over in times where there's been more money around, that the whole question of risk is perhaps not been as at the forefront of people's minds. In other words, that they've been slightly risk averse. I think what we're suggesting is that you have to look at different things you've not looked at before that may be more risky than they were previously. But to go into that from our point of view as auditors is to ensure that you identify what the risks are in doing that, and that you work out what types of risks are acceptable to you as a council and those that are not. So it's really just this question.
Change of culture.
I think that does lead to situations where you're looking at options. The report refers to a number of occasions to options appraisal. So I think that means looking at options that in the past perhaps have not been, something that's been particularly appealing for whatever reason. And one of them may be that it's relatively risky. So I think there is a kind of shift of mindset required, that one, that you start to consider things that in the past were considered perhaps unacceptable, whether it be politically or financially or just from a point of view of risk.
Okay.
Just, excuse me, is that a supplementary, Mr. Chair?
Slightly different thing. It was about a question about alios that I was going to ask. I don't know.
Well, if it's not a supplementary.
It's not a supplementary.
Okay.
I took it off my list. I'll just be very brief. Page 22 and 23, I'll just lump them together to get through it quicker. But I appreciate that you're saying that local government has carried out some work on reducing sickness absence, but the Exhibit 16, if we look at the highest, 16 days. You know, it's an extra 3 weeks of sickness absence, and I just wondered how that, I know that there's the average, which is about 10 days, but you know, how does that compare with the rest of the public sector and indeed the private sector, and do you feel that local governments are doing enough? And I'll lump that together with the exhibit, well, paragraph 123, the road maintenance budget. We're always told that our roads are in a terrible state, and yet it's been reduced by 21% in last 2 years. You say that there's a huge backlog for road maintenance. I don't know how much. Are you quite satisfied that the road maintenance budget has been, I think you say acceptable standard of our roads is 66.7%. So 1/3 of our roads, council maintained roads, are not of an acceptable standard. Is that a cause of concern? And I'm almost finished. So it's the sickness absence and yes, the cut in the roads maintenance, and 1/3 of our roads not an acceptable standard.
Yes, I'll start, and my colleagues may wish to follow me. You referred to comparatives for sickness absence. Paragraph 110 gives one or two comparisons there with teachers and fire and rescue and police. Beyond that, I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything else from other sectors. Do we have any? We can go back to base and write to you about that if you would wish, just to give you further information.
Okay, it's fine.
And the second point on roads maintenance, we did a recent roads maintenance report in the last month, which updated these figures. It's now a marginal improvement on the 1/3. It's now something like 67 or 68%. I can't recall, but it's a marginal improvement.
By 0.5%.
Whatever it was not very much.
But there's still been a cut of 21% in the last 2 years.
Whatever it was, you know, I personally was quite surprised it had gone up at all, and I suspect a lot of people around the country were. But it had improved on this definition of acceptable. And I think at that point you then have to look at what is defined as acceptable. I can't quote it to you just now, but I suspect the engineer's definition of acceptable is that it's safe, rather than
so that means anything. 1/3 of our roads are unsafe.
Well, it means that. Do you want to go into detail on this?
I don't, other than the fact that it refers to, I think the wording is acceptable condition.
I think the point for me, Mrs. Scanlon, this is that I think the roads one is a very good example of where the budget decisions that councils are having to make are really very difficult. They all know that the roads conditions isn't where it needs to be as a result of many years of underinvestment, and they're trying to do something about that at the time of reducing resources and having to make very difficult decisions about balancing spend on roads with schools, social work, care for vulnerable people and everything else they've got to do. So it is, I think, a good example of how they're really struggling to balance those priorities as best they can locally.
My final question, Convener, Mark Griffin was asking about reserves. I'd like to ask about debt, council debt. Obviously, as a member for the Highlands and Islands, I'm aware that Highland Council debt was around 600 million and its housing debt about 150 million. I see that now in total, well, probably about the same, coming up for 750 million. But if I look at Exhibit 19, the City of Edinburgh, there seems to be, I appreciate it's 2003-4 to 2011-12, but there does seem to be quite an increase there. So my two questions are, has there been any significant change in debt in recent years? Are you concerned about the debt that councils hold? Are you concerned about their plans to repay that debt, if ever? And what's happening here in Edinburgh?
Okay, perhaps I could take the Edinburgh question first, just to get it out of the way. It's relatively straightforward, because Edinburgh, of course, has the trams project, was an enormous amount of debt. What was it at the last count? About 700 odd million, and or the likes, maybe 800. And the purchase of their headquarters at Waverley Court. Those things contributed hugely to that increase. Going back to the concern point, we monitor, we ask questions about this debt issue all the time. The early discussion today we've had on the Prudential Code is part of that concern. And it's the very point you make, that it's fine borrowing, but if you're just saddling future generations with liabilities, then that's clearly of concern. So we do monitor it very closely, and it needs to be backed up by assets and a demonstration that it's sustainable in terms of interest payments and indeed capital repayments. I don't know if my colleagues want to add to that.
Yeah, very briefly on taking the Edinburgh one first, I think it's always important with the big councils to bear in mind that they are big councils, and the numbers are going to be big by dint of that. Edinburgh spends in the order of about £1 billion to £1.5 billion a year, and I think its assets of the order of about £4 billion. So I think we've always got to look at it in that context. I think Mr Bailey flagged up a couple of reasons why, in particular, Edinburgh's has gone up over the last 10 years. On the generality, I think there is something that needs to be looked at. It actually ties back to Mr Coffey's earlier question about the Prudential Borrowing Code. We've pulled this together in a way that brings in all the indebtedness. So we've got things in there, including if you like, the straightforward traditional borrowing, but also the liabilities that come from things like PPP. And I think it's quite stark, the variation that we see across all 32. Now, I would temper that with it does show the overall picture. If you go into individual councils, there are reasons. For example, one particular reason that would stand out for some councils is the fact that they've had housing stock transfers, so they don't have housing stock anymore. That would have a significant bearing. But it's worth, I think we felt for the purpose of this report and looking at a situation where local government finances have been under a lot of pressure and are likely to become more so in the next few years, 14, 15 onwards in particular, that this was something that needed to be highlighted so that people are asking the very questions that you're asking today.
Convener, just my final question is, I haven't got the figure in front of me, I did have it in a parliamentary answer, but the amount that councils are paying each year in interest payments is an amount that cannot be used for delivery of public services. And when you look at, I mean, that runs into millions and millions.
Yes, and it's the interest payments, as you rightly say. It's also PPP payments rather, and any other cost of a long-term fixed nature, because you're then tying the hands of the council behind its back.
Okay, thanks, Mr Doris.
Thank you, Convener. I thought Ms Scanlon made an interesting point about whether thinking the local authorities do all these things that they don't need to do. I maybe kind of tease that out a little bit and say, well, local authorities get statutory obligations that they need to do. There's essential things they need to do, whether it's a statutory obligation or not. There's desirable things that they're going to want to do. There's beneficial things for their community they're going to want to do. So I think it was, I mean, I understand why Mary Scanlon would be saying that, but that's a bit one-dimensional to frame it in such a way, and that's not the way I would like to see our local governments do. I don't want them to disinvest from our community. I want them to be proactive and involved in them. Now, I want to focus on the statutory obligations of local authorities, because it's not currently a statutory obligation to have an integrated health and social care system, but it shortly will be, because some local authorities and health boards couldn't work in partnership together, and Scottish Government's felt necessary to make that a statutory obligation. As part of that, we assume there's going to be a single accountable officer responsible to both the health board and the local authority. There will be not aligned budgets anymore, there will be a single budget for budget scrutiny. No, I'm about to ask quite a significant question, Ms Scanlon. There's been a degree of planning, I assume, from some local authorities. In terms of what local authorities are doing, to what extent has there been planning in relation to that? And can you point to any concerns you may or may not have to get ready for that? Because it's going to be a significant increase in responsibilities in local authority. It's going to fundamentally change the way they do their business for a significant part of their budget.
Can I start with a very general point and then invite Fraser to answer your question? The general point I would make is that if we go back to CPPs for a minute for context, one of our concerns is that the health boards, particularly, are not as engaged as actively in the CPPs as other parts perhaps are. And then, of course, we've got the Health and Social Care Partnership as part of that whole melee, if you like. Fraser, do you want to go?
My sense, Mr Doris, is that they are pretty well prepared for it. They're planning carefully for it. I think the bill obviously only came out last week, so the detail of that, obviously councils and health boards are getting their head around, but that's not to say they haven't been doing anything in waiting for that, and indeed some shadow boards are already in operation. Some council areas already have effectively integrated health and social care. So it's a mixed picture across the country. I think what is clear and the bit that people are trying to figure out is, to use your phrase from earlier, the brass tacks about how this is all going to work in practice. So if you take an example, I know that Dundee City Council has a social work department. So their department in the council has children's services all the way through to adult and older people services in one department. Neighbouring authority in Perth and Kinross has a department that's education and children's services. So their children's services bit is separate from the adult and older people's bit. The question then for Tayside Health Board is, how do you create a community health care partnership that works for those two communities given the different starting places? So I think they are absolutely thinking about it. I think they are preparing well for it. I don't underestimate the challenge of actually making it work in practice.
Reassuring. I wasn't sure what answer I was going to get. I genuinely didn't know the level of preparedness. I was just looking at the action points for councillors where you're asking them if they're prepared for it. So I wasn't sure if you knew if they were prepared for it or not, but I'm delighted that it appears as there is a lot of good work. Will you be continuing to monitor this area? Because you said it's patchy across the country. So if there are examples of particularly good practice, the converse means in some parts of the country perhaps not so. So what will be the role of yourselves in monitoring that going forward? Back to you.
A variety of things. Clearly, locally, auditors will be very interested in how arrangements are going for integration. It forms a very important part of our consideration for the performance audit programme into the future, and we'll certainly want to look at how implementation has gone. And as well as that, I think there's a whole series of things we can do to keep an eye on how planning and delivery of the integration is actually going. So we have colleagues in Audit Scotland whose job it is to keep an eye on community health and care as an ongoing part of their job, and we'll continue to monitor that very closely. So in terms of the big policy and public service reform initiatives that are out there, it's up there with the biggest of them, so it's still very much front and centre for us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr Doris. Mr Keir, you were trying to come back in. Is it something very quick?
I know you talked about it before, but it's the relationship with Alios and how I know you're doing some work in it. Could you tell us, is there any quick update you could give us on that?
I think our concern with Alios, and you're right, we have a paper coming to the Commission's meeting next week. Concerns perhaps too strong, but certainly our interest in this just now is the extent to which there's a public accountability of public money in Alios. There is, of course, financially, but when you get to performance, that's another matter.
Happy to wait till next week.
Thanks, Mr Keir. That draws it to a close. Just to go back on the discussion earlier around community planning partnerships, I'm certainly open to any suggestions from members if there's some way they want to take this forward, but I would just remind them that it's not that long ago that we did look at the joint report on improving community planning, Joint Accounts Commission and Auditor General report, and we actually pursued some of these concerns with the Scottish Government, and in their correspondence they founded really on the Statement of Ambition and the forthcoming community empowerment legislation as being the vehicles to improve things. And I suppose at that point the committee generally noted that that was the case and I assumed that we would take a watching brief as that developed. So that's kind of where we are on that issue at the moment, Mr. Beattie.
I suppose my concern really is the timescales that we're looking at. We're looking at years to see something coming through. I mean, we're sitting at the moment with something that's been in place for 10 years, which we don't even know is fit for purpose or delivering. We're hearing today that it could be another couple of years, maybe, before we actually have any indications on that, because of improved reporting, improved processes. It seems an awful long time for such a key issue to be out there.
I don't disagree. Just all I would say is that the response of the Scottish Government to those concerns was, this is what we're doing, the statement of ambition and that the programme that flows from that, and legislative change in the Community Empowerment Bill, which I think we haven't seen yet, so we don't actually know. So I'm more than open to any suggestion that we do something else, but I think if we take it up with them again, we'll get the same answer. Until that legislation appears, maybe we should make a note for ourselves that when that legislation appears, we need to look at it and satisfy ourselves that actually it is the case, that it is the vehicle to address some of these concerns. And if it's not, then take that up. Yeah. Because I think, I think what you're raising there, Mr. Beattie, is very much what we raised at a couple of months ago when we looked at the joint report. So yeah, is that? We wait for that legislation to appear and perhaps have a look at it. Okay, thanks very much, and thanks very much to our witnesses from the Accounts Commission, Audit Scotland. We'll now pause briefly to let Mr. Bailey and co leave while we move to item 4 on our agenda, which is the Landfill Tax Scotland Bill. This is correspondence. We wrote previously to both the Scottish Government and to Audit Scotland asking a number of questions about the audit arrangements around the new landfill tax and the new body Revenue Scotland, who will be responsible for it, and the question really of the Auditor General, the degree to which she was satisfied that the audit arrangements which were emerging would allow her to properly audit the new tax. The correspondence is in front of members. I'm happy to open it up for comments or... Yes, Mr. Scott.
Yeah, can I just, Convener, take up one point in the answer to your letter from Mr. Swinney, in which I think is broadly fair, but at the top of page 2, when the committee asked about annual performance information being published, the answer doesn't actually say annual, it says operational performance. Had the word annual or indeed any other time been in that answer, I've been perfectly relaxed about it, and I'm sure the inherent content of that answer is on an annual basis, but I think it is quite important we nail down the timescales that we should expect information to be provided. I mean, SEPA, after all, provide an annual report. That includes their accounts. It's audited by Audit Scotland, etc., etc., etc. But I thought the one aspect of that we could have done with from the Cabinet Secretary would be clarification around the timescale.
Happy to write again and ask for that clarification. I mean, I must admit, I thought the response was fair and addressed all the questions. And the correspondence from the Auditor General seemed quite reassuring. Yes, Mr. Donoghue.
Yeah, yes, Convener. Just on that very point that Tavish Scott raised, where he says he intends to establish an agreement, I take it when we write, we'll just be asking when that agreement will be established, because surely that would give us the information that Tavish was looking for.
Well, I think Mr. Scott's wanting us to write and ask for the reassurance that that agreement will ensure that SEPA will publish information at least annually. I think it's slightly more than you were suggesting, but yes, I would imagine that would be contained in that agreement. Apart from that, is the committee willing to note this correspondence?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll now move into private session. Ask any members of the public to leave.